The morning the bailiffs came to Hartmere, the frost had not yet left the long meadow, and Eleanor Whitcomb stood in the farmyard with a folded paper pressed flat against the inside of her glove. She did not take it out. She had learned that a thing held in reserve was worth more than a thing spent too soon. Around her, the men in gray coats moved through her father's land with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once been told no, counting the sheep, marking the byre door with chalk, reading aloud from a schedule of seizure as though the words themselves were a kind of weather that could not be argued with. To the parish that gathered at the gate, she was already a settled matter. The Whitcomb girl, they would say, whose father had been fool enough to trust a duke's promise and die before he could prove it. Poor thing, with nothing now but a tenancy run to ruin and a stubborn refusal to weep where they could see her. She did not weep. She watched the road instead, where a single rider had appeared at the crest of the hill, and brought his horse down through the cold light, at a pace that made the bailiffs lift their heads. If you have ever waited at a gate for a verdict you were certain you already knew. Stay with me, because this one had not yet been written. What Eleanor did not yet permit herself to believe was that the man on the road had come for a reason she would misread for a very long time. The rider was Adrian Calvert, the Duke of Ravensmore, and the parish knew his name the way it knew the names of saints and storms, as a thing larger than any one person who might be standing in front of you. He came down the lane in a navy coat cut close to the shoulder, his face still as ice over a river, and he did not look at the bailiffs or the chalk marks or the gathered villagers. He looked at the woman in the plain gray gown who had not run to the gate to plead with him, and something in his bearing changed by a degree so small that only the horse beneath him felt it. He drew up. He did not dismount at once. He sat above the yard in the manner of a man recalculating a sum he had believed already settled. 6 months earlier, Eleanor's father had sat at the kitchen table with the late autumn rain on the windows, and told her that the Duke had given his word. £300 advanced against a wool clip, the lease secured for another 12 years, the whole of Hartmere safe under the protection of the House of Ravensmore. Thomas Whitcomb had not been a foolish man. Whatever the parish chose to say of him after he had served the old Duke for 30 years, and had reason to trust the family. He had taken the agreement on a handshake in the great library at Ravensmore, and he had come home lighter than Eleanor had seen him in years, and he had been dead of a fever within the fortnight, before a single line of it was set down where a court could see. That was the wound the parish could not see, and the one Eleanor carried under her composure like a stone sewn into a hem, not the loss of the land alone, the loss of her father's good name, the slow certainty in every face at church that her father had imagined the whole arrangement, that grief had loosened his judgment, that the new Duke owed nothing to a dead tenant's daughter and would say so plainly when she dared to ask. She had dared to ask. She had written 3 letters to Ravensmore and received no reply, and the silence had been its own answer, and the bailiffs at the gate were the punctuation at the end of it. What none of them knew was what she had found. 10 days after the funeral, when she had finally brought herself to sort the papers in her father's writing desk, a receipt in the steward's own hand, dated and signed, acknowledging £300 received on account from the estate of Ravensmore against the Hartmere wool, with the terms of the lease named in full beneath. Her father had not imagined it. Someone at Ravensmore had written it down and given it to him, and then someone at Ravensmore had decided to pretend it did not exist. Eleanor had not shown the receipt to anyone. She had considered taking it to the magistrate, and had understood, with the clear, cold arithmetic her father had taught her, exactly how that would go. A duke's word against a paper that a clever man could call a forgery. A grieving girl, with a motive and a debt. She had folded the receipt into a square no larger than a playing card and carried it against her wrist beneath her glove, and she had waited, because waiting was the only weapon she had been left, and she was determined to spend it well. "You are Miss Whitcomb," the Duke said. It was not a question. His voice was low and level, the words placed one beside the other with no warmth to soften them. "I am," she said. She did not curtsy, as deeply as the parish would later agree she ought to have. "Your Grace has come a long way to watch a small matter." A muscle moved in his jaw. The bailiffs had stopped their counting. Every face at the gate had turned to the two of them, and the Duke seemed to feel the weight of all that attention settle, and did not shift beneath it. "Stop the seizure," he said to the man with the schedule without taking his eyes from Eleanor, "until I have understood it." The man with the schedule began to explain that the order had come down through the estate office under the proper authority, and the Duke turned his head a single degree and looked at him, and the man stopped. That was the first thing Eleanor learned about Adrian that morning, that he did not raise his voice to be obeyed. The second thing she learned, and misread entirely, was that when he looked back at her, there was something in his gray eyes that was not the contempt she had braced herself against, and her body knew it before her mind would permit the knowledge. A small, unwilling warmth moving up the back of her neck in the cold. He did not stay. He gave the order, and he turned his horse. He was gone up the lane before she could decide whether to call after him with the truth pressed against her wrist. She let him go. A thing held in reserve, she reminded herself, was worth more than a thing spent too soon. For 3 days nothing happened, and the not happening was its own torment. The bailiffs withdrew, but did not leave the parish. The chalk marks stayed on the byre door. Eleanor went on with the work because the work did not care what a duke had decided. The ewes still had to be brought down from the high pasture before the weather turned, the kitchen fire still had to be fed, the small accounts still had to be balanced in the ledger her father had kept in his upright hand and she now kept in her own. She was 24 years old, and she ran a failing farm alone. And she had been raised to believe that competence was a kind of dignity no one could take from you, and she clung to that belief the way other women clung to their rosaries. On the 4th day a letter came from Ravensmore, and it was not a reply to any of hers. It was a summons. The Duke requested the presence of Miss Whitcomb at the great house to discuss the matter of the Hartmere lease. She read it twice and felt the trap in it before she could name the trap. A woman of her station, summoned alone to a duke's library, had no protection but her own conduct and the parish's willingness to believe the worst of her regardless. Yet she had asked to be heard, and here was the hearing, and she would not be the one to refuse it. Ravensmore rose out of the autumn landscape like a thing the land had grown, rather than a thing built upon it. Gray stone, the color of the November sky. The bare trees of the avenue throwing their long shadows across the gravel. A footman took her at the door, with a face carefully empty of judgment, and she was led through halls hung with portraits of Calverts dead 200 years, and she kept her chin level and her hands still, and she did not let the house make her small. The library, when she reached it, was a room the size of the entire ground floor of the farmhouse. Floor to ceiling shelves of leather spines, a fire burning low in a marble hearth, tall windows giving on to the gray grounds. The Duke stood at one of the windows with his back to the door, and he did not turn at once, and she understood that this, too, was a kind of test, whether she would fill the silence with nervous speech. She did not. She waited. After a moment he turned, and the low light caught his face, and she saw for the first time that he was younger than the parish made him, in their telling, perhaps 34, with a hard, composed mouth and dark hair, and the particular stillness of a man who had taught himself to give nothing away. "You have run that farm alone since your father died," he said again. "Not a question. I have. The estate office tells me it is failing." "The estate office," Eleanor said, "advanced £300 against this year's wool, and then called in a lease 6 months early. A farm may fail for many reasons, Your Grace. Some of them are not the farmer's." She watched the words, land. She had not meant to say so much so soon, but the room had made her reckless, the portraits and the leather and the careless wealth of it all, and the receipt was warm against her wrist, and for one moment she came very near to drawing it out and laying it on the great desk between them. She did not. Something in his face had changed when she spoke of the £300. A swift narrowing, a recalculation, and she filed it away to examine later. "You believe my house owes you a debt," he said. "I believe my father was given a promise. I believe he had reason to trust it. I do not expect your grace to take my word for that." She let the smallest weight fall on the last sentence, and she saw him hear it, and she saw him not understand it yet. "Sit down," he said. It was the first of his commands, and she heard in it only the cold instruction of a man accustomed to arranging people in rooms. She sat. She did not yet know that the order had been, in its own buried way, a kindness that he had seen her swaying very slightly with the cold and the long walk and the weight of the house, and had given her the chair before she could be made to ask for it. What followed was not the dismissal she had braced for. He asked her about the farm, the acreage, the wool clip, the state of the buyer, and the high pasture, and he asked with the precision of a man who understood land, and she answered in kind. And somewhere in the middle of it the conversation stopped being a duke interrogating a tenant and became two people who both knew the same difficult thing talking about it honestly. She did not soften toward him. She told herself very firmly that she did not. Yet her body, which had never learned to lie as well as her face had, was aware of exactly where he stood in the room, at every moment, and when he crossed to the desk to consult a ledger, and his sleeve passed near her shoulder, she felt the nearness of him, like heat from a fire she had not known was lit. "I will look into the matter of the £300, he said at last. "You will hear from me. I have heard that the silence of Ravensmoor is very eloquent," she said, rising. "I wrote 3 times, your grace." He went still. "You wrote to me to the estate office." 3 letters. None was answered. Something crossed his face that she could not read, and would not understand until much later, the slow recognition of a man discovering that letters addressed to him had been stopped before they reached his hand. "You will hear from me," he said again, and this time the words were different, lower, weighted with something that was almost an apology, and could not quite become one. Eleanor walked the 4 miles home in the failing light, and she did not let herself hope, because hope was a thing the parish would punish in her, and because a woman who hoped was a woman who could be disappointed, and she had decided long ago to be the other kind. The witnessing came 9 days later, and the Duke saw it, though she did not know he was there. It was at the parish church, after the Sunday service, when the rain had driven everyone under the lich gate and the talk had turned, as it always did, to the Whitcomb matter. Eleanor had a child by the hand, the youngest of the Foss children, whose mother kept the parish poorhouse, and whose father was dead. In the war, a small boy of 6 who had been crying, because the older children had told him his boots were charity boots, and not his own. Eleanor knelt in the wet under the lich gate, heedless of her one good gown, and she told the boy a thing her own father had told her, that a thing given in kindness was not a lesser thing than a thing bought, that the only shame in a gift was in the giver who counted it, and never in the child who wore it. She did not know that the Duke had ridden to the church that morning on a matter of his own, that he had drawn his horse up under the dripping yews at the edge of the churchyard, that he had heard every word. She knew only that when she rose and turned he was there, mounted and motionless in the grey rain, watching her with an expression that had nothing of the cold composure she had come to expect, and that he turned his horse and rode away without a word, as though he had seen something he had not meant to see, and did not know what to do with. That was the day the Dowager first spoke the word that would follow Eleanor through the rest of it. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmoor, Adrian's grandmother, was a woman of 70, who had buried a husband and a son and a grandson's young wife, and had organized her entire grief into the management of the family's standing, which she defended the way a general defends a boarder. She had heard that her grandson had stopped a lawful seizure on the word of a tenant's daughter, and she had come down to Ravensmoor from the dower house with her companion and her diamonds and her certainty, and she had summoned Eleanor, not to the library but to the gold drawing-room, where the light was less kind. And she had looked at the plain grey gown and the level chin, and had named her, in a voice pitched to carry to the companion by the window an adventuress. That is what you are, child, whatever prettier word you give it, the dowager said. Her fan held a half-inch too high. A clever girl with a paper grievance and a duke's pity to work upon. I have seen a dozen of you. You will not be the one who succeeds. Eleanor stood very straight in the unkind light. I have asked for nothing, your grace, but to be heard. They always say so. The fan moved. You will leave Ravensmoor, and you will take your grievance with you. And if you have any sense, you will be grateful the matter has gone no further. Eleanor curtsied exactly as deeply as the occasion required, and not 1 degree more, and she left, and she did not take the receipt out, though her wrist was warm with it the whole length of the gold drawing-room. An adventuress. She turned the word over on the long walk home and found that it did not wound her as the dowager had meant it to, because it was so entirely wrong and because a wrong name, she had learned, had no power over you if you knew your own. The Duke came to Hartmere himself the following week, without sending word, and found her in the byre with her sleeves turned back and her arms deep in the difficult business of a ewe that could not deliver her lamb. He did not stand at the door and command. He took off his fine coat and hung it on a nail, and knelt in the straw beside her, and did as she told him. And between them, in the cold and the blood and the urgency of it, the lamb came free and lived, and Eleanor sat back on her heels in the straw with the new creature, steaming in the lantern light, and laughed. Once, before she remembered who was beside her, he was looking at her, not at the lamb, at her. And the look was no longer deniable, though she would spend a great deal of effort over the following days denying it. You should not have done that, she said, meaning the coat, the kneeling, the ruin of his fine linen. Your Grace, I have done very little of use in my life, he said low. Permit me to have done this. He rose, and he gave her his hand to help her up, and she took it, gloveless, her bare cold fingers in his bare warm ones, and they both went still, and the lantern guttered, and for the length of one held breath, neither of them moved. She drew her hand back first. That was the proximity that undid her careful arithmetic, and she lay awake that night, turning it over. The warmth of his hand and the laughter she had not meant to let him see, and the terrible dawning suspicion that the man the parish called cold was not cold at all, but rather a man who had walled something away so completely that he had nearly forgotten where he had buried it. The midpoint came, and with it the wound, on a grey afternoon when she had been summoned again to the library to hear what the estate office had found, which was nothing, because the record of the £300 had been removed from the ledgers. The Duke told her this plainly. His anger held under such tight rein that it showed only in the whiteness of his knuckles, where his hand rested on the desk. And then, because she had asked him a question she had no right to ask, why a man of his power had let the estate be run by a steward who could stop his letters and alter his ledgers, he told her the rest. His wife had died 3 years before, not in childbirth, as the parish believed, but of a long wasting illness through which he had been told, by the same trusted steward, that everything was being managed, that he need not trouble himself with the running of the estate, that he should attend to his grief, and leave the rest to men who had served the family for decades. He had believed it. He had handed the whole of Ravensmoor to other men, and gone into his sorrow as into a locked room, and he had come out of it 3 years later, to discover that the men he had trusted had been quietly remaking the estate to their own profit, and that a tenant named Whitcomb had been ruined in the doing of it, because he had chosen not to know. I gave my word to no one for 3 years, he said, and his voice was very low, and he was not looking at her, but at the fire. I let other men give it for me. Your father trusted my house, and my house failed him, and I was too deep in my own grief to see it done. He turned then, and the composure was gone from his face entirely, and what was under it was grief, plain and human and old. I cannot give your father back his name by wishing it, but I am no longer content to let other men speak for me. Eleanor stood in the great room with the receipt warm against her wrist, and she understood finally that the silence of Ravensmore had not been contempt. It had been a wound. And she did a thing then that surprised her, that she had not planned, and could not have planned. She did not take out the receipt. Because she saw that to lay it on the desk in that moment would be to make his confession into a transaction, to answer his honesty with leverage, and she found she could not do it. She would give him the truth, but not yet, and not as a weapon. I will tell you that I held my breath at that. The first time I followed her through it, the way she chose the harder kindness over the easier proof. Stay with her a little longer, the receipt has its hour, and it is coming. The Dowager's escalation came swiftly after, because the Dowager Duchess had not survived 70 years without learning to recognize the moment a thing slipped from her control. She saw the way her grandson's eyes followed the tenant's daughter across a room. She saw the danger in it, not to the family's fortune, which was secure, but to its standing, to the careful order of marriages and alliances she had spent her widowhood arranging. There was a rival already in the house, Lady Cassandra Vane, a viscount's daughter, with £10,000 and a profile like a coin, brought down to Ravensmore by the Dowager under the pretext of a visit and the actual purpose of a duchess. And the Dowager set about her work. She arranged a dinner. 30 at the long table, the county's best families. The candles and the silver and the careful seating that put Lady Cassandra at the Duke's right hand and Eleanor, invited with deliberate cruelty, far down among the lesser gentry where her plain gown could be seen against the diamonds and found wanting. Eleanor understood the design of it as she entered the room, and chose to walk through it with her chin level, because to flinch was to confirm the verdict, and she would not. It was at that dinner that the Dowager voiced the word the second time in the hearing of 30 people, when the talk turned to the Hartmere matter, and someone asked too loudly whether it was true the Duke had stopped a lawful seizure. "My grandson has a generous nature," the Dowager said, smiling down the table. "And generous natures attract adventuresses as honey attracts wasps. We are managing the matter." The word landed in the silence she had built for it. Along the table, the faces turned to Eleanor, the small, cruel pleasure of a room that has decided whom it is permitted to despise. And Eleanor felt the old heat climb her neck, and felt her hand tighten on the stem of a glass she did not raise, and across the long table she felt rather than saw the Duke go very still. He did not defend her at the table. She noted it. She told herself she had expected nothing else, that a man would not spend his standing on a tenant's daughter before 30 witnesses, and that the warmth in the byre had been a thing she had imagined into being out of her own loneliness. She got through the dinner. She walked home in the dark 4 miles, with her slippers ruined and her pride intact. And she did not cry until she was inside her own door with the bolt drawn. And even then only briefly, because there was the fire to feed and the mourning to prepare for and a farm that did not care how a duchess had named her. What she did not know was that the Duke had risen the moment the dinner ended, had gone to the estate office in the cold dawn, and had begun methodically to take his house back. The dark moment came, at the worst possible time, on the day the new lease documents were to be signed, the documents that would have made Hartmere secure at last, the £300 acknowledged, her father's name restored in the only language the law respected, ink on vellum under the Duke's own seal. Eleanor walked to Ravensmore that morning with something dangerously close to hope in her chest, and she was met at the door not by a footman, but by the steward himself, a smooth gray man named Mr. K. Pell, who informed her with every appearance of regret that the Duke had been called away on urgent business to London, that the signing was postponed indefinitely, that perhaps Miss Whitcomb would understand that a man of his Grace's position could not always be governed by the small matters of a single tenancy. She understood at once that it was a lie, and she understood at once that she could not prove it. And the two understandings together were the closing of the door she had feared from the beginning. Behind Mr. Brote, Pell in the hall, she saw Lady Cassandra on the stairs in a morning gown, and she saw the Dowager's companion, and she understood that the house had closed ranks while the Duke was conveniently absent, and that by the time he returned the lease would be signed away to some other tenant, and the receipt in her glove would be the only thing left that said her father had told the truth, a single sheet of paper against the whole weight of Ravensmore. She went home. She took the receipt out for the first time in weeks, and laid it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time in the gray light. And she made the choice that the parish would never have credited her with, because the parish believed her an adventuress, and an adventuress would have run to the magistrate or the newspapers or the highest bidder. Eleanor did none of those things. She wrote a letter in her own upright hand, so like her father's, addressed to the Duke directly and not to the estate office, and she did not enclose the receipt, and she did not threaten, and she did not plead. She wrote only that she had something her father had left her that bore upon the matter, that she would place it in the Duke's own hand and no other, and that she would be at the parish church on Sunday, after the service, if he wished to see it. Then she walked the letter to Ravensmore herself, and gave it to the youngest stable boy, a child of 10, with a penny and an instruction to put it into the Duke's hand, and no one else's. And she trusted a child where she could not trust the house, because the child had no standing to protect. The Duke had not gone to London. He had been kept from the door by his own steward's careful management, the same management that had buried her letters and altered the ledgers, and he came out of 3 days of manufactured business to find a stable boy at his stirrup with a folded note, and he read it. And the parish would later say that no one had ever seen the Duke of Ravensmore ride so hard. The public reversal happened in the same arena where the verdict had first been passed, which was the parish church, because that was where the dowager had named her and where the county gathered, and where the truth, if it were spoken, would be spoken before the only witnesses whose opinion governed a woman's life in that country. Eleanor came to the Sunday service in her gray gown with the receipt against her wrist, and the dowager came in her diamonds with Lady Cassandra beside her, settled into the family pew as into a fortress, certain that the tenant's daughter had finally overplayed her hand and come to make a scene that would ruin her past saving. And the service ended, and the rain held off, and the whole parish spilled out into the churchyard among the grey stones, and the dowager turned to deliver in the open air before everyone the final and decisive cut that would end the matter. She got as far as the word, "There is the adventuress now," she said to Lady Cassandra, but pitched, to carry her fan rising. "Come to try her grievance. One last time, I expect, before the whole county." The sound of a horse came hard up the lane. The Duke came through the churchyard gate on foot, having left the horse where it stopped, and he crossed the wet grass among the gravestones, with the whole county turning to watch him. And he did not go to his grandmother, and he did not go to Lady Cassandra, and he did not stop until he stood before Eleanor, in her plain gray gown at the center of the suddenly silent crowd. She looked up at him. She had the receipt, half drawn from her glove, ready to give him the proof at last, the thing she had held in reserve through everything. He did not look at the receipt. He looked at her face. "Ah, keep it," he said low, so that only she could hear. "I do not need the paper. I never did." Then he turned, and he spoke so that all of them could hear, and his voice was level and carried to the far wall of the churchyard, and the words were few. "This is the woman I intend to marry." The silence after was the kind that has weight. The dowager's fan stopped in the air. Along the churchyard, the faces that had turned to despise turned instead to wonder, and the recalculation moved through the crowd like wind through standing barley, the whole parish revising in a single breath everything it had decided about the Whitcomb girl. Lady Cassandra's coin-bright profile went still, and then, to her credit, composed itself with a dignity that suggested she had perhaps wanted this no more than the dowager had wanted it for her. And the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore, who had buried a husband and a son and a grandson's wife, and had organized all of it into the defense of her family's standing, looked at her grandson's face and saw something there she had not seen since before the wasting illness took the young wife from the house. "Adrian," she said, and her voice was not the voice that had named Eleanor an adventuress. It was an old woman's voice. "You cannot do this." "I have given my word," he said, and he turned back to Eleanor. And the words were for the crowd, and for his grandmother, and for himself most of all, the man who had let other men speak for him for 3 years. and would do it no longer. Before all of you, I have given it plainly, where it can be heard, and I will not unsay it. And there it was, the thing the parish would tell for a generation, the Duke of Ravensmore claiming a tenant's daughter in the churchyard where his grandmother had come to ruin her. Not with a long speech, not with a public humbling of the old woman who had wronged her, but with a single sentence that could not be taken back. He did not gloat. He offered Eleanor his arm. And the steward, Mr. Mubba, Hell, who had stopped the letters and altered the ledgers and manufactured the business in London, was found within the week to have been doing the same to a dozen other tenancies, and was dismissed. And the parish understood at last where the true grievance had lain. And Thomas Whitcomb's name was spoken in the village again. With the respect it had always been owed, Eleanor took the Duke's arm. And before she let him lead her from the churchyard, she did one last thing, because some debts are paid not in proof, but in trust. She took the receipt from her glove, the folded square she had carried against her wrist through every cut and every silence, and she pressed it into his hand, not as evidence, as a gift. He looked down at it, and he understood, and he closed his fingers around it, and the two of them walked out through the lych gate, where she had once knelt in the rain to tell a frightened child that a thing given in kindness was not a lesser thing. The dowager came to Hartmere in the spring, alone, in a plain carriage, and she did not announce herself, and she found Eleanor in the kitchen garden with earth on her hands. The two women looked at each other for a long moment across the new beds. The old woman had not come to apologize in words, because women of her generation and her station did not have those words, but she had come, which was its own language, and Eleanor understood it, and she wiped her hands and asked the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore whether she would care to come in out of the wind. The old woman came in. It was the beginning of something that would never quite be warmth, but would in time become respect, and respect between two strong women is not a lesser thing than warmth. They were married in the parish church at midsummer, quietly before a small gathering rather than a crowd, which was Eleanor's choosing, and which the Duke had agreed to at once, because he had learned that she measured the worth of a thing by its truth, and not its size. The Foss boy carried the ring on a cushion, and did not drop it, and wore boots that were unmistakably his own. The receipt hung in the library at Ravensmore after that, not framed in gold but in a plain dark frame, on the wall between the tall windows where the Duke could see it from his chair, and visitors who did not know its history took it for some dull document of estate business and passed it by. Yet Adrian Calvert knew. On winter evenings, when the snow came down past the tall windows and the fire burned in the marble hearth and Eleanor sat with her sewing in the chair that had become hers, he would look up sometimes at the small framed paper on the wall, the receipt his wife had carried against her wrist through every cruelty the house had offered her. The proof she had chosen in the end to give rather than to wield. It was the only thing in all that grand and ancient house that he counted as truly his, because it was the only thing in it that had been given to him freely, by a person who owed him nothing and chose him anyway. The snow fell. The fire held its low, warm light against the dark. Eleanor looked up from her sewing and found him watching the paper on the wall, and she smiled and went back to her work, and the great house at Ravensmore was, for the first time in a very long time, a home. If Eleanor's quiet courage stayed with you, I would be glad to know it. Thank you for staying until the end.